Thank you, Kate. I'm going to invite Professor Andrews and Professor Jenkins to come up onto the stage and join us for a brief Q&A session. Do you guys have microphones?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right, and I have Kim Scarborough, who's my co-moderator behind the curtain here. She's been moderating the questions. I invite you, if you do have any additional questions, to get them in quickly. But Kim, would you like to start us off with the first question for the panel?
Sure. So this first question is directed to Jesse. During your presentation, you had a quote, "We can't hide the true cost of energy by Peter buttering it around," which they said was a great phrase. What exactly does this mean, and which cost do you refer to, and what does not hiding look like?
Sure, yeah, great question. So if you look at mass market residential retail rates right now, right, we pay a volumetric flat electricity tariff, right? We pay something like 19, 20 cents a kilowatt hour where I live. And that covers basically all of the costs of electricity generation with the exception of, and policies that we layer on top of that, with the exception of a very small fixed charge of, $10, $15 a month. The reality is that most of the costs of the electricity system don't scale with how many kilowatt hours I consume. And those that do vary dramatically in terms of the cost of providing that energy over time, right? In wholesale electricity markets, we have hourly electricity prices. In the day-ahead market, we have 5-minute settlements for real-time deviations from the day-ahead positions. And those prices vary from negative $20 or $50 to several $100s per megawatt hour, or 20, 30 cents per kilowatt hour. And we don't see any of that, right? Any of that time of use information about the actual cost of delivering electricity to us, or if I have a solar panel or battery or something else in my home, the value of discharging that energy back to the grid. That's just the kilowatt hour part, the part that actually scales with the volume of consumption at different times with different value. Most of the costs are the grid, right? Roughly half of the cost is the transmission and distribution network. Those costs are going up much more rapidly, by the way, than the wholesale energy costs. And we size the grid to meet the maximum peak coincident usage of that grid, not the volume of kilowatt hours that we push through the grid. And we don't have any information about whether or not we're contributing to that peak or not. So I have an electric vehicle. PSEG has offered a rebate program for off-peak charging of that electric vehicle. That's a good start. At least that recognizes that generally I'm not contributing to the peak if I'm charging overnight. And it's offering me a lower discounted rate for the energy because generally energy is cheaper at night. But I actually still don't know when I'm contributing to the peak. And it's not a managed charging program. It just says, start charging at 9 p.m. And there's a lot of EVs on my block. It's, clustered adoption is a thing. So if everyone's car is scheduled to trip on at, 9 p.m., every household's now dropping 5 to 11 kilowatts of new demand on the grid. That's, like 20 air conditioning units flipping on all at once. And that's probably driving the local peak to 9 p.m., right? And so now we are contributing to the peak. So we need to know, either through managed charging programs or through price signals, that how to get our flexible demands, and EVs are a huge one, but also smart thermostats and potential for thermal energy storage in buildings and other things away from those peak periods so that we're not driving unnecessarily upgrades to the grid. All that's much more complicated, right, than the way we price electricity today. The good news is that I don't really have to think about it, right? If we have the right pricing signals, the algorithms in my car, in my charger, in my smart thermostat can handle it for us. Computers are smart, right? We don't have to think about it. So we can set certain preference settings and we can let the computers do their thing and manage that complexity for us. And I think that's the big difference between now and 10 or 15 years ago is that computing and sensing and smarts is cheap and ubiquitous, and we need to leverage that. And if we do, we can we can basically avoid massive, billions and billions of dollars of unnecessary transmission and distribution grid upgrades and peaking power plants that are poorly utilized. And we can encourage people to consume electricity when cheap renewables are available and not when polluting power plants are on the margin. And we can also send more accurate signals about where and when we should be installing distributed generation like batteries and solar. And so I think the era of lazy rate design is over, and we should be leaders in New Jersey on that front.
Thank you, Jesse. Kate, Clint, would you like to add anything to that? Or?
I'll just mention that when you enter a world of cyber-physical systems, you do have to pay money for both the physical part, the transmission grid, and the cyber part. So getting to that future has some cost.
Great, thank you. Kim, do we have a next question for the panel?
So we had a couple of questions regarding the cost of rooftop solar. So I'll try to combine. Why is the cost so high, and what can we do to make it cheaper?
We'd like to start.
I wish I had a clear, simple answer to that question. I did we had a whole series of episodes on Shift Key to try to get to the bottom of it because it's a really important question. I'd just say I think we should be having hearings on that question. We should be having convenings between Princeton and Rutgers, right, to get to the bottom of that. I think there's a lot of different complex lessons. The primary answer that I often hear is that permitting and interconnection are far too challenging and far too fragmented, which act as substantial barriers to entry for competition, for new entrants. You have to be really good at navigating the local permitting office and the utilities interconnection process and all of that, which means that the industry is quite concentrated at the higher level. There are lots of local installers, but most of them are under the umbrella of a few large firms. That means that the cost of customer acquisition, basically what that means is that we have to sell hard as opposed to having customers come to solar installers, and like you go to a roofer when you need to repair your roof and go to them. And so the cost of customer acquisition in the rooftop solar industry is actually twice the cost of the panels themselves. So we pay more for marketing, right? All the push marketing that has to happen to convince people to go through all this long-term, multi-month process of installing it, getting connected to the grid, and all of that. And that drives up costs, and then the cost of financing goes up with that because you have to finance all this extra cost. So if we can make the permitting and interconnection process simple and unified across the entire state, or ideally across the country, that would help a lot. And there's some things like the Solar App program that DOE launched that are trying to make that easy, to sort of push-button permitting. There are virtual inspections that many other jurisdictions have adopted so that the inspector doesn't actually have to go out to the house. You can take some pictures, you can upload them, and if everything looks fine to an AI, they say good, and they flag some of them for physical inspection. There's lots of things we can do there. The other thing I'd say is that right now, because of net metering, the fact that we compensate solar against the volumetric retail rate means that the solar industry only has to beat the volumetric retail rate. They don't really have to beat each other all that much because there's not a concentrated enough industry. So they're value pricing against that as opposed to pricing against their costs. And that also means that the margins they're earning, according to NREL and others, are again more than the cost of the panels themselves, 60, 70 cents a watt. And that margin might be good for rooftop solar installers, but it is a sign that the industry is not very competitive. And so, we need to figure out how to make the market very competitive and as easy to get somebody out to install solar for cheap on your roof as it is to fix a leak when your roof leaks. I had that happen recently. We called somebody 2 days later, our roof was fixed, right? That should be how easy it is to install solar. And if you do that, then it costs a few $1,000s to put a system in place. You don't need to go take out a giant mortgage to do that. Some people can pay for that in cash, or you can, roll it into a home equity line of credit or whatever else. So the more we drop down the cost, it also compounds to the cost of financing.
One dimension of that I'll just point out is that some of the costs that Jesse's talking about are physical things that programs like the IRA can help make cheaper, but a lot of those things are processes or they're market design or they're really policy-driven things that the state and local governments have a lot of sway over or full control over. And so there are a lot of states and communities that are really looking at things like permitting processes, siting processes, these customer relationship processes that are things that you all really can still do and don't need federal money and don't need federal sort of direction or regulation or authority to do.
All right, and I have a question for the panel I'm going to ask you guys. If you had your top 3 priorities about what New Jersey should do to sustain innovation in addressing climate change, what would they be? So I'm going to start with you, Kate.
I'll do one on energy, one on transportation, one on resilience. On the energy side, I guess I'd say don't stop. Meaning all this federal stuff, offshore wind and then the pulling back on the permits and all this stuff, it sounds so daunting, but there is all of this stuff you can do, the permitting process, the siting processes, the consumer engagement processes that you can do without the federal government, even on offshore wind, right? There's stuff you can do to think about your ports and where you'll want this to be when the dynamics at the federal level are different, that you shouldn't stop doing. Like, be ready, get ready. On the transportation side, I think there's huge opportunity in funding and infrastructure and the way that we, as departments of transportation around the country, think about what projects we build, where, when, why, and what data we look at in evaluating how to prioritize those projects, and to think more holistically about the community benefits, environmental benefits, health, safety, cost that we want to pull into our transportation planning processes. And on the resilience side, I'll go back to the master planning and thinking about the spatial dimensions of really looking at the state as a public conversation, thinking about what you need to do where.
All great suggestions. Well, okay, 3. I would say maybe just high-level things. One is we should be figuring out how to unleash and harness cheap solar and batteries. Right? These are the cheapest ways to add, cheapest and fastest ways nationally now to add new kilowatt hours and flexible capacity to the grid. And we have a long way to go before we've saturated the value of solar and storage in New Jersey. Many states have 20, 30, 40% of their energy supply now coming from solar, with tens of gigawatts a year of batteries being deployed, and we're not one of those yet. I would say on the transportation side, I'm hopeful that the California waiver for advanced clean cars and advanced clean truck standards will be preserved. But I do think we need to start contingency planning with California and New York and other states that are committed to the electric vehicle transition to think about what we can do that is not dependent on federal policy. One example of that might be a fee-based structure that we charge through our registration costs here in the state that are solely state jurisdictional, that would discount vehicles with lower emissions and increase the cost of registration of vehicles with higher emissions. That could be revenue neutral. And could be solely state jurisdictional. That's just one of many possible ideas. But I think we are seeing how dangerous it is to rely on federal continuity and policy to achieve critical goals. And there's simply no way we meet our clean energy and climate goals at the state level if we can't continue to see the EV transition move at pace. And the last one I'll say is we should be, I think, having a broad conversation and be state policy innovators around clean heat. Which is almost as large a challenge, as transportation and power, and where I don't think we really have a clear state policy model that you can just copy and paste across the country. So there's room to innovate there. Other states like Massachusetts and New York and California and Washington are trying different things. We should probably be convening, and learning from other states, but also thinking about what works in the New Jersey context. And that's both in building, heating, and industrial process heat, which is an enormous consumer of gas. And an important tool where we have lots of emerging options for electrifying industrial process heat as well.
Great. Glenn.
I'd like to offer 2 types of suggestions. So one is financial. I think we need to really work on the questions of how do we provide a stable investment climate given the uncertainties that are emanating from the federal level. And how can we offset losses that investors feel or homeowners feel to make them a little more confident that, yes, this makes sense for me to put my money into this. And then the second category is going to relate to land use. And on the sort of on the energy facilities area, this is something where we've sort of forgotten how to do it. We cited a lot of power plants, we cited a lot of transmission lines, and then we didn't have to for a generation. And now we need to figure it all out again, and we need to make sure that there's an actual visible energy facilities siting council in the state, and not a function that's hidden inside of some other state agency. There's also, and we heard a little bit about this already this morning, there's a huge local responsibility for helping people realize that they are in harm's way and to get them out of the flood zone. And in a way, do I dare say this? A positive outcome of this Trump move around FEMA towards pushing responsibility down to the state and local level could be that we take land use planning a little more seriously and add the risk component to the land use decision-making.
Great, thank you. Well, that's all the time we have. I'd like to thank Clint, Jesse, and Kate. Give a round of applause.